recently we put a photo up on the Facebook page of Devil's Elbow Road. I've been driving from Newcastle in Lawrence County up to Grove City in neighboring Mercer County when I happened to notice the street sign, and curious and having a bit of free time, I drove the length of the road to see what there was to see. This ended up being a pretty short trip. The hilly, wooded road quickly opened up to become a lane of fairly newer homes. I took a picture anyway, well, because why not? I mean, how many Devil's Elbow roads are in Pennsylvania? Well, there's 3 actually. 3 is a magic number. Aside from the Devil's Elbow, which I'd recently encountered, there's also Devil's Elbow Road in the vicinity of Bellefonte and Jersey Shore in Center and Lycoming counties, respectively. Armed with curiosity and a picture, I did what I often do in these sort of situations, and I went to go get lunch. And it was at the grocery store that I got to speaking with some people there because, unsurprisingly, there is a story about the Devil's Elbow. The story starts in the late 19th century. There is a young couple on their way home. They're riding in a buggy and it's late. Somehow, their horse gets spooked and the buggy wrecks, going over a bridge that crosses a stream in the darkest section of the road. Badly injured, the young woman dies, either from exposure or drowning. The man who tells me the story wasn't really sure on this, but figured it must be drowning because why mention the stream, right? And I can't argue with him. Regardless, the young lady is deceased, and to this day, or rather, on some nights, the sounds of the crash can be heard. Other storytellers state that some people claim to see swaying lights, like those of a lantern, moving through the trees. The story is not especially unique. In fact, it is essentially identical to another road located only 4 miles away, almost perfectly north. The story of the Covered Bridge Road up by Vollant, really not in Vollant, but somewhat between Vollant and Newcastle. Anyway, the Covered Bridge Road story. The road is actually named Covered Bridge Road. One would assume there is a covered bridge on that road, and I believe you would be correct. It is the second covered bridge in Lawrence County that still exists today, the other being the bridge on McConnell's Mill on the Slippery Rock Creek, which I'll talk about actually in just a little bit. Anyhow, the story of the Covered Bridge Road goes that a young Amish girl was killed when her family's buggy wrecked and rolled into Neshannock Creek. The ghost of the young girl is said to walk along the creek at night looking for her family. I have heard this story before too, and there are also, of course, the ghost lights associated with it, where people say they see swaying lights moving in a lantern type fashion. Now, plenty of people have drowned in the Neshannock. I mean, it's no Mississippi River, but it was only a couple years ago when 2 young Amish boys drowned while wading in the Neshannock. If I remember the story correctly, they fell into a hole and could not swim, and it was very tragic. The creek along Devil's Elbow, though, is no Neshannock. From what I can see, it's a little more than a trickle that comes off Hottenbaugh Run. Though I suppose 100 years ago, the water could have been very different, so who knows? Now, there's a few ways of looking at this. First, there could be no true origin story. I mean, these stories sound very familiar to ghost stories that we hear all over the United States. But I do believe that there could be a real origin story with the young girl, where the family's buggy wrecked into the Neshannock and a young person lost their life. It's very tragic. It stays in the community for a long time. And there's a lot of Amish people in this particular region. So I could see it happening. What I believe happened is that maybe there was such a tragedy. It's not hard to imagine. And it could have been far more recent than, say, the late 19th century. However, I believe that the story then immigrated down to Devil's Elbow Road, because with a name like that, you have to have a story almost. So it just makes sense that as the initial ghost story of Covered Bridge Road spread, it then migrated down to Devil's Elbow. I believe the real reason for the name Devil's Elbow, and though I can't be certain of this, was probably for a warning dealing with maybe the curve of a road, like a sharp, dangerous curve that had to be drawn like that due to topographical regions. And early in Devil's Elbow Road, as I drove it, there was definitely, it was a hilly, wooded area until you got to the top where it opened up. I do believe a real tragedy occurred at one, possibly both of these locations, but that this real world event is what led to the ghost story. But there are other stories that sound very, that make the rounds across the Americas. Of course, everybody's heard of tale, and I believe just near every town has train tracks where it's said that, like a school bus of children was hit by a train, and so if you put your car in neutral on the train tracks at night and maybe a honk a couple times, the kids will push you off. I swear every town I've ever lived in had this sort of story. The other one, of course, is a variation of that almost, and let's go over to the other covered bridge in Lawrence County, the one over at McConnell's Mill, which crosses the Slippery Rock Creek. And in all reality, the Slippery Rock Creek at this area is more of a river and far more dangerous than the Neshannock, which we mentioned earlier with the covered bridge road story. Every year, I believe at least one person drowns in the Slippery Rock Creek in that region. If not every year, it's close to it. I know each summer I hear a story of somebody getting lost in the park. I know just with the mild winter we had, a lot of people were going hiking, and the sun was still dropping by 5 in the evening. I know just a couple months ago, a couple of hikers from Butler County became disoriented and lost in the park. And it'll probably be within a month we'll hear the story of someone nearly drowning or having drowned in the Slippery Rock. So there's a lot. It could be an emotional place for a lot of people who remember or knew or were involved in some way in those stories. But the bridge, there's a story that there was a car wreck right by in front of the bridge there, or on the bridge, although I can't find any evidence of this, but maybe somebody can. Just like the covered bridge story, a young girl dies. Now, to this day, people say that you can see her if late at night you drive on to McConnell's Mill Bridge and shut your car off and honk your horn a couple times, 3 times, 3 being that magic number people like. And then you can see the girl in your rearview mirrors, but when you turn around, she's not there. And I'm a bit ashamed to admit that I've been with friends who have tried this, and honestly, being in the park at night's a bit spooky with the tall hills and the long shadows, and then when you're on the bridge, it is very dark with the car off. And of course, if you had the sort of cars that I did as a teenager, there's the very real fear that the car isn't going to start again. But this story, too, is heard on a lot of different covered bridges, and it seems as though covered bridges exist in large part today almost to be a seed for stories. But anyhow, this story this week is really just kind of about coming across Devil's Elbow. There's a lot of roads out there with funny names, and we're having trouble finding the origin stories of some of these names, but I really do believe that Devil's Elbow has little to do with the occult and more to do with a very sharp turn. Anyhow, if you know of any other roads with weird names, weird stories, email us at drpennsylvania@gmail.com or check us out on Facebook. Just look up Dr. Pennsylvania. Look for our owl in the keystone. You'll be sure to find us.